It began like any other December in the quiet, manicured community of Maplewood Heights, a place where the lawns looked cloned, the driveways gleamed with identical stone, and the Homeowners Association ruled like a silent monarchy. Every year, residents were reminded through printed newsletters and sternly worded emails that decorations should remain tasteful and modest. Those words, tasteful and modest, had become something of a religion around here, and breaking them was treated like a sin. But for one man, Ethan Miller, Christmas wasn't about modesty. It was about joy, color, and light. Ethan had grown up in a small town where every house competed for the brightest decorations, where kids bundled in scarves pointed in awe at glowing reindeer, and where the first snow carried the smell of pine and cocoa. He had carried that warmth into adulthood, and every year, he recreated it with pride. This year, he had gone a little bigger than usual. A towering, 12-foot inflatable Santa stood proudly on his lawn. Strings of shimmering LED lights cascaded from the roof like frozen waterfalls. His driveway was lined with candy cane arches that glowed softly through the night. The centerpiece was a hand-built sleigh, covered in twinkling lights, with Rudolph's red nose blinking in steady rhythm. Ethan hadn't done it for attention. He had done it for the kids in the neighborhood, the ones who still believed in magic. He'd noticed how, over the years, Maplewood Heights had become duller, stricter, quieter. Halloween decorations were frowned upon, backyard parties monitored, and even holiday lights had to be uniform. It felt lifeless. So this year, Ethan decided to bring life back to his little corner of Maplewood. The response was immediate and divided. By the next evening, a stream of families from nearby streets came by to take photos. Children pointed, parents smiled, and cars lined up just to see the house that dared to shine. Ethan stood by the window each night, coffee in hand, feeling the glow of something more than just LEDs. The glow of simple happiness. But not everyone shared that warmth. Across the street from behind lace curtains, the HOA president, Margaret Drayton, watched with growing fury. Margaret had ruled Maplewood Heights for nearly 15 years. Her word was law, and she believed her sense of order kept the neighborhood respectable. She had built her reputation on fines, enforcement, and fear, and she intended to keep it that way. It wasn't long before the first letter appeared. Ethan found it tucked under his doormat, printed on thick paper with the HOA letterhead embossed at the top. It was brief but sharp, warning him that his decorations violated community standards and demanding their immediate removal. The tone was cold, bureaucratic, and threatening. A $500 fine would be imposed if he failed to comply within 72 hours. At first, Ethan laughed. He thought it must be a mistake, or at least an overreaction. After all, his decorations weren't offensive, they were festive. But when he checked the HOA rules, he saw how vague they truly were. No excessive lighting or decorations that may disturb community aesthetics or tranquility. It was a clause so subjective that it could be used against almost anyone. As the evening fell, Ethan looked at his home glowing under a soft snowfall. The lights reflected off the white roofs and turned the whole cul-de-sac into a winter painting. He knew what the HOA wanted: silence, conformity, control. But for the first time, he didn't feel like complying. Over the next few days, whispers began to circulate among neighbors. Some sympathized with him, secretly admiring his boldness. Others shook their heads, afraid of what the HOA might do next. A few even removed their small wreaths and lights, terrified they might be targeted next. Margaret's second letter came quicker than expected. This time slipped into his mailbox with a stamped notice of penalty, $500 fine due within 10 days. It accused him of willful defiance of HOA regulations and warned that further disciplinary action could include legal fees or property liens. It was absurd, and yet entirely within her power. That night, Ethan stood outside in the crisp air, surrounded by his glowing display. The sound of soft carols drifted from a nearby radio. A few cars slowed to take pictures. And in that moment, as he watched strangers smile at the spectacle, a small ember of defiance ignited in him. He realized something fundamental: the HOA didn't care about beauty or peace. It cared about control, about making everyone identical, silent, obedient. He saw it clearly now, in the way neighbors bowed their heads, in the way every house looked the same, in the way fear lived behind every picket fence. Ethan had a choice. He could take down the lights and pay the fine, Or he could stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been bullied into submission. He chose the latter. Over the next few days, he began sketching plans, not to take the decorations down, but to double them, to turn his house into something beyond anything Maplewood had ever seen. He scrolled through online forums, learning about synchronized light shows, programmable LEDs, and projection mapping. He ordered new supplies, bought extension cords in bulk, and stayed up late watching tutorials. If they wanted excessive, he thought, then they would get excessive. By the time the HOA's third letter arrived, threatening further action if the decorations weren't removed, it was already too late. The delivery trucks had come. The front yard was piled with boxes labeled holiday light kit, inflatable reindeer, and outdoor projector. Ethan stood in his garage surrounded by tangled cords, tools, and rolls of glittering material. A quiet smile crept across his face. The fine no longer bothered him. The HOA's threats no longer scared him, because now, it wasn't about money, it was about principle. That night, the snow fell thicker. The cold sack was quiet except for the hum of electricity from Ethan's glowing house. Inside, he drafted a list titled Operation North Pole. Each bullet point was more ambitious than the last. A synchronized music display, an ice sculpture Santa, fake snow machines, a light tunnel for kids to walk through. Maplewood Heights had never seen anything like it. And soon, neither would the HOA. The morning after Ethan finalized his Operation North Pole plans, Maplewood Heights woke up to the sound of quiet rebellion, the faint buzz of power tools, and the steady rhythm of a man on a mission. The HOA might have seen itself as an unstoppable authority, but Ethan Miller had become something it never expected, the face of defiance wrapped in tinsel and garland. As the sun rose over the rows of beige, uniform homes, Ethan's house was already transforming into a spectacle. The once simple suburban lawn now looked like a construction site for Santa's workshop. Extension cords snaked through the snow, towering ladders leaned against the roof, and wooden cutouts of elves and reindeer waited to be painted. Every passing car slowed. Some drivers honked in amusement, others stared in disbelief. Word spread quickly, Ethan's doubling down. By the afternoon, neighbors began gathering near the sidewalk. At first, it was quiet curiosity. People who had once avoided conflict with the HOA found themselves whispering excitedly. Parents pointed out the changes to their kids. Teens filmed TikToks posting captions like, "This dude is declaring war on our O." Within hours, the clips began circulating online, reaching people far beyond Maplewood Heights. Margaret Drayton noticed the commotion from her living room window. Her coffee cup trembled slightly in her hand as she watched a cluster of neighbors laughing near Ethan's driveway. She had worked tirelessly to maintain control, endless meetings, fines, and rule books, and now one man was unraveling it all with strings of colored lights. The HOA board convened that evening in Margaret's dining room, as they often did when something urgent occurred. The other members, polite but spineless, nodded in agreement as Margaret spoke with growing irritation. She called Ethan's display a gross violation of community standards, a potential fire hazard, and an attack on the harmony of the neighborhood. But not everyone agreed. For the first time, a soft murmur of dissent rippled through the group. One of the younger board members, Jenna, hesitated before voicing her thought that maybe the display wasn't so bad, that it was actually bringing people together. The room went silent. Margaret's eyes narrowed like frost forming on glass. Outside, Ethan worked late into the night. He wasn't trying to provoke anyone personally. He simply refused to bow down. As he connected wires, adjusted lights, and tested sequences, he could feel the quiet thrill of rebellion. Each light strand he added felt like another victory, small but satisfying. By the end of the week, Operation North Pole had taken form. The house was no longer just decorated. It was transformed. A massive archway of lights marked the entrance to his property. The roofline shimmered with patterns that danced in time with music playing from hidden speakers. In the yard, a 12-foot inflatable Santa had been joined by a glowing sleigh, reindeer, and candy cane forest. And at the center of it all stood a sign that read, in bold red letters, "Welcome to the North Pole, where joy is not a violation." The sign was the final spark. Within 24 hours, Ethan received another notice, not just from the OA, but from their attorney. The letter accused him of defiance, public disturbance, and unauthorized use of amplified sound. It threatened legal action, additional fines, and even property liens if he did not remove the decorations immediately. But this time, something unexpected happened. Neighbors started showing support, quietly at first, then openly. Someone left a card in his mailbox that said, "Thank you for standing up for all of us." Another family left a thermos of hot cocoa at his doorstep. Children began calling his yard Santa's house. And each evening, they gathered at the sidewalk to watch the lights flicker to Christmas songs. One night, as the light show played, cars filled both sides of the street. The air was alive with laughter, music, and camera flashes. Parents lifted kids onto their shoulders, couples took selfies, strangers waved at Ethan's window. The HOA patrol, a group of volunteers who normally enforced parking violations and lawn inspections, tried to disperse the crowd, but they were met with polite resistance, and even a few sarcastic holiday greetings. The control Margaret once wielded effortlessly was slipping away, replaced by something more powerful than authority: community spirit. Soon, even neighboring subdivisions heard about the North Pole House. Local reporters came by, taking photos for a feel-good holiday story. The article described Ethan as a man standing up against HOA overreach in the name of Christmas cheer. Overnight, Maplewood Heights was on the map, and Margaret's nightmare had just begun. At the next HOA meeting, attendance was at an all-time high. People who hadn't shown up in years crowded into the clubhouse, many there to support Ethan. Margaret stood at the front, papers in hand, ready to restore her crumbling order. But what she didn't expect was the shift in the room's energy. Homeowners, tired of endless fines and petty rules, began voicing their frustrations. They complained about the arbitrary restrictions, the intimidation tactics, and the way the HOA made them feel like tenants instead of owners. Ethan's situation had lit a spark, a collective realization that maybe they'd all been too afraid for too long. Margaret tried to regain control, raising her voice, citing regulations and threatening lawsuits. But the murmurs of dissent grew louder. Her words, once powerful, now sounded desperate. That night, as the meeting ended in chaos, Margaret realized something terrifying. She was losing control of Maplewood Heights. The neighborhood she had ruled for over a decade was slipping away, one twinkling light at a time. Meanwhile, Ethan sat at home, unaware of the full storm he had created. He was exhausted but satisfied, watching his house glow in the winter night. He knew more letters would come, maybe even court threats. But for now, he didn't care. He had done something that mattered, something that reminded people what joy looked like. But what he didn't know was that Margaret wasn't done. Behind closed doors, she began plotting something new, a way to crush his rebellion once and for all. If the HOA's rules couldn't stop him, maybe the law could. She contacted the city council, the local fire department, even the power company, searching for any loophole, any regulation she could weaponize. And soon enough, she found one, a clause buried deep in the city's noise and light ordinances. As snow fell quietly over Maplewood Heights, a plan began to take shape in Margaret's mind. One that would turn Ethan's victory into his biggest challenge yet. The neighborhood might have rallied behind him, but the real battle was only just beginning. By the time Ethan's dazzling display had become a local attraction, Maplewood Heights was unrecognizable. What was once a quiet rule, obsessed community had turned into a nightly festival of laughter, cars, and cheer. Every evening, people poured in to see the North Pole House, as the news had named it. Parents handed out cookies to children, couples strolled arm in arm, and even residents who once bowed to HOA pressure now smiled beneath the glow of Ethan's lights. But in the midst of this warmth, a cold shadow lingered, the kind that grew in the corners of power. And that shadow had a name: Margaret Drayton. Margaret had always believed she was protecting Maplewood Heights from chaos. To her, uniformity meant peace and control meant stability. But lately, as she watched Ethan's house dominate the neighborhood's reputation, something deeper stirred. Not order, but envy. He had something she didn't: admiration. Her plan began quietly. Late at night, after the neighborhood lights dimmed, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and stacks of HOA documents. The gentle hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as she scrolled through legal codes, cross-referencing local ordinances with HOA bylaws. Her glasses reflected the blue glow of the screen as she hunted for a weakness. A way to take Ethan down without appearing vindictive. Then, she found it. Buried in the city's municipal code was a clause about nuisance lighting and amplified sound. It was vague but powerful, allowing city enforcement officers to issue citations for displays that interfered with the enjoyment of nearby properties. It wasn't an HOA rule, it was a city law. Which meant that even if the HOA's authority was challenged, she could still weaponize the government itself. Margaret spent the next few days documenting everything. She took photos of the crowd blocking traffic, videos of the light show, and even timed how long the music played. She compiled the evidence into a neat folder and sent it to city officials, presenting it as a community safety concern. Her tone was professional, her words measured, but her intent was clear: bring Ethan down. When the city's compliance officer visited the neighborhood, Ethan was caught off guard. The man was polite but firm, explaining that several complaints had been filed regarding noise, traffic congestion, and excessive lighting. He didn't mention Margaret by name, but Ethan could see the invisible fingerprints all over it. The officer issued a formal notice of violation. If Ethan didn't reduce or eliminate the lighting and sound within 10 days, he could face city fines. Fines that made the HOA's $500 penalty look small. That night, as the lights flickered across his lawn, Ethan felt the weight of it all. He had expected the HOA to fight back, but this felt different. This wasn't just neighborhood politics anymore. This was war by bureaucracy. He stood outside, watching families enjoy the display, and for the first time, a quiet doubt crept in. Was it worth it? But before he could answer that question, something unexpected happened. The next morning, he found a group of neighbors on his driveway, not to complain, but to help. They brought extension cords, tools, and decorations of their own. They wanted to add to the display to make it even bigger. Word had spread that the city was trying to shut him down, and the community had decided to fight back with unity. One by one, houses on Ethan's street began putting up lights of their own. At first, it was small, a wreath here, a few colored bulbs there. But within days, the entire block shimmered with defiance. Even the quietest families joined in, hanging garlands and projectors as a show of solidarity. Margaret's worst nightmare was coming true. From her window, she watched as the order she had built for years unraveled into what she saw as chaos. A kaleidoscope of color, laughter, and individuality. The HOA's carefully curated aesthetic of beige walls and white lights was gone, replaced by a riot of reds, greens, and golds. She responded the only way she knew how: say, escalation. Margaret called an emergency HOA board meeting. Her tone was sharp, her words colder than the December wind. She argued that Ethan's rebellion had endangered the entire community, that property values were at risk, and the neighborhood's reputation was being tarnished by media attention. She proposed drastic measures: legal intervention, suspension of voting rights, and even lien placement against Ethan's property. But for the first time, the board wasn't unified. Jenna, the younger member who had once hesitated to speak, stood firm. She argued that the HOA had gone too far, that the people were tired of living under fear. Others nodded quietly. The cracks in Margaret's authority widened. The meeting ended without resolution. Margaret stormed out, her power slipping through her fingers like snow melting in her palm. Still, she refused to accept defeat. That night, under the cover of darkness, she went to Ethan's property with her camera again. She took more photos. This time of parked cars, noise levels, and litter left behind by visitors. She compiled it all into a lengthy report and sent it to the city once more, labeling it urgent. A few days later, just as Christmas approached, Ethan received a final notice. The city had decided to escalate enforcement. If he did not shut down his display by Christmas Eve, his property could face official fines and mandatory removal orders. It was a devastating blow. Ethan sat in his living room, the soft glow of the lights reflecting off the window. He felt the exhaustion of weeks of fighting. Against the HOA, against bureaucracy, against fear. Outside, laughter echoed faintly from families still visiting the display. He didn't want to let them down. He thought about the children who came every night. About the joy that had returned to the neighborhood. About the way strangers had become friends under the glow of his lights. He realized then that the fight was no longer about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced by unfair authority. If the city wanted to make an example of him, then he would make one right back. Over the next few days, Ethan made a decision. He wouldn't take the lights down. Instead, he would go even bigger. He reached out to local media again, telling them his side of the story. He described how the HOA and city were trying to find the spirit of Christmas. The story exploded online, with headlines calling him the man who stood up to the HOA Grinch. By the time the city's enforcement team arrived for inspection, they didn't find a quiet house to shut down. They found hundreds of people gathered on Ethan's street, singing carols under the swirling snow, holding signs that read, "Save the North Pole," and "Let the lights shine." News vans parked nearby, cameras rolled, social media flooded with live streams. The entire country was watching a small suburban neighborhood take a stand against control. The city officers, seeing the spectacle, hesitated. They didn't issue fines. They didn't touch the lights. They simply took notes and left, quietly, without a word. From her window, Margaret watched in disbelief. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. The harder she tried to control the situation, the more it slipped from her grasp. As the night deepened, snow began to fall again, blanketing Maplewood Heights in white. Ethan stood in his yard, watching the lights shimmer across the snowdrifts. For the first time in weeks, he smiled, not out of triumph but out of peace. Yet even as the laughter echoed through the cold air, he couldn't shake a feeling that it wasn't over. Margaret wasn't the kind to surrender quietly. And somewhere in that silent, frozen night, she was already plotting her next move. One that would take the conflict beyond decorations and into something much darker. The morning after the caroling crowd had turned Ethan's front yard into a symbol of resistance, Maplewood Heights felt different. The streets were still, but the air carried an unmistakable current, the feeling of a neighborhood that had seen the impossible happen. For the first time in years, the HOA's authority had been publicly challenged and humiliated, not in a meeting room, but under the bright shimmer of Christmas lights. Ethan's home had become more than decoration. It was a statement. Every strand of light, every glowing snowflake, every inflatable figure seemed to pulse with defiance. Neighbors who once whispered complaints now waved when they passed. Families left cards and small gifts on his porch. He had become something unexpected, the hero of Maplewood Heights. But victory always has a cost. The local news coverage had drawn attention far beyond the neighborhood. Cameras came daily, interviewing residents, filming the lights, capturing children's laughter. Ethan tried to stay humble, but each visit added pressure. The HOA meetings grew tense, and whispers began spreading that Margaret was preparing something drastic. For days she had been silent. No letters, no notices, no appearances. That silence was unsettling. It felt deliberate, calculated. Margaret Drayton wasn't known for retreating. She was known for waiting, watching, and then striking when no one expected it. And then, the storm began. It started subtly, with anonymous complaints posted online, claims that Ethan's light show was unsafe, that it caused traffic jams, and that someone could get hurt. The posts were shared on community groups, spreading fear and doubt. A few residents, intimidated by the growing tension, began pulling their own decorations down, afraid they might get caught in the crossfire. Then came the letter, not from the HOA, but from a private law firm representing concerned residents. It accused Ethan of creating a public nuisance and threatened civil action for disturbance and property devaluation. The phrasing was eerily similar to Margaret's usual tone. He didn't need a signature to know who was behind it. The fight was no longer about fines or lights. It had become personal. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the glow from his decorations casting soft patterns across the floor. For the first time, he felt the exhaustion catching up, the endless stress, the letters, the fear that one wrong move could cost him his home. He had stood up for joy, but now it felt like the joy was being drained away piece by piece. As he stared out into the cold night, he noticed something unusual. A dark car parked across the street, its engine running, headlights off. It had been there for hours. Occasionally, he caught a flicker of movement inside, as if someone was taking photos. The thought sent a chill down his spine. He closed the curtains and tried to ignore it, but deep down he knew exactly who was behind it. By morning, The car was gone, but a new notice had been posted on his mailbox. It was from the city again, citing reports of safety hazards. An inspection was scheduled for the following day. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Margaret had moved beyond petty HOA tactics. She was now orchestrating a campaign, not just to make him remove the decorations, but to break him. Ethan spent the day cleaning up, making sure every wire was safe, every connection sealed. When the inspectors arrived, they found nothing out of order. The house was up to code, perfectly safe. But even as they left, one of them warned him quietly, "Someone's really pushing this case hard." That night, as snow began to fall again, Ethan realized something profound. He wasn't just fighting an HOA anymore. He was fighting the idea that individuality itself was a threat. That someone could dictate how much joy was acceptable, how much light was too much, how much freedom one person could have before it became a problem. He refused to give in. But Margaret wasn't done. The next morning, she filed an official motion with the HOA board to have Ethan's membership privileges suspended, including access to the neighborhood's common areas and amenities. She also proposed an emergency amendment to the HOA bylaws: no outdoor decorative lighting exceeding prescribed lumens or decibel levels during any calendar year. The vote would happen in 2 days. If it passed, Ethan's lights could be legally forced down permanently. News of the proposal spread quickly. Neighbors began to argue online, dividing the once united community. Some, frightened of escalating conflict, sided with the HOA. Others stood firmly with Ethan, calling Margaret's actions tyrannical. The same street that had once laughed together under his lights now simmered with tension. That evening, as the light show began, Ethan noticed fewer visitors. The usual crowd of smiling faces was smaller, quieter. A sense of unease hung in the air. Even the children seemed subdued. He felt the weight of their uncertainty, as if everyone was waiting to see how much longer the magic would last. Across the street, Margaret watched from her window, her expression unreadable. She had spent years shaping Maplewood Heights into a reflection of herself, neat, orderly, predictable. Ethan had turned it into something she couldn't control. In her mind, he wasn't just breaking rules. He was breaking the identity she had built her life around. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Branches bent, snow whipped across the lawns, and in the distance, a transformer buzzed and flickered. Around midnight, a loud pop echoed through the neighborhood, followed by darkness. The lights went out. Ethan rushed outside, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. The entire block was dark, except for the faint glow of distant streetlights. He checked his circuits, his breakers. Everything seemed fine. Then he saw it. The main power cable to his display had been cut clean through, buried beneath the snow. Someone had done it deliberately. He stared at the severed wire, anger rising in his chest. The display was more than just decorations. It was a symbol of everything he stood for. And now, under the cover of night, someone had tried to erase it. He knew who it was. The next morning, he reported the vandalism to the police. They took a report but could do little without evidence. Ethan had security cameras, but the footage was mysteriously corrupted, static flickers, and black screens during the exact time of the outage. Margaret denied any involvement, of course. In her calm, practiced voice, she expressed deep concern for the vandalism and suggested that, perhaps the overwhelming media attention had attracted unwanted attention to the neighborhood. Ethan knew it was a lie, a calculated one. But as the days passed, and the vote on the new lighting restriction loomed closer, the mood of Maplewood Heights grew heavier. What had begun as laughter and unity now felt like the quiet before a storm. The community was fractured, and Margaret's influence, though weakened, still lingered like frost on the edges of every conversation. As Christmas approached, Ethan faced a choice. He could back down, take the lights down voluntarily, and end the conflict once and for all, or he could risk everything and keep them shining. And deep down, he already knew his answer. Because the fight wasn't about lights anymore. It was about freedom. And about proving that even in the darkest winter, one person's light could still shine bright enough to challenge the cold. But what Ethan didn't yet realize was that his act of defiance was about to push both him and the HOA past a point of no return. The morning of the vote arrived with an eerie calm. Maplewood Heights looked peaceful on the surface. snow gently dusting rooftops, wreaths glimmering faintly in the pale winter sun. But underneath, tension pulsed like an electrical current. Every driveway, every window, every neighborly wave carried the same silent question. What will happen tonight? Ethan awoke early. He hadn't slept much. The events of the past weeks had weighed on him heavily. The city warnings, the vandalism, the endless letters from Margaret and her law firm. Yet, even in exhaustion, there was clarity. He wasn't fighting for approval anymore. He was fighting for the right to exist without fear in his own home. The vote would determine the future of Maplewood Heights. Margaret's proposed amendment, if passed, would give the HOA sweeping new powers to control decorations, lighting, and even outdoor events. On paper, it sounded bureaucratic. In practice, it meant the end of individuality and of everything Ethan had stood for. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the Maplewood Community Hall. By midday, chatter spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Cars drove slowly past Ethan's house, some offering thumbs up, others shaking their heads. News outlets returned, positioning cameras discreetly along the street. A few online forums even labeled the event, "The Battle for Christmas." As the afternoon faded into evening, the air grew thick with anticipation. The North Pole house stood ready once more, repaired, rewired, and glowing brighter than ever. The lights flickered across the snow, painting the street in a cascade of color. It was both a statement and a shield. At exactly 6:45 p.m., Ethan put on his coat and stepped outside. The cold bit at his cheeks, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound. As he walked toward the community hall, he could see silhouettes moving through lit windows. The crowd was larger than he expected, far larger. Almost every resident had come, filling the parking lot and spilling onto the lawn. Inside, the tension was palpable. Rows of folding chairs faced the raised platform where the HOA board sat. Margaret stood in the center, dressed sharply in gray, her papers neatly stacked, her expression composed. The rest of the board sat stiffly beside her, silent, uncomfortable, aware that this night would define them. When Ethan entered, whispers rippled through the crowd. Some greeted him with nods of encouragement. Others looked away, unwilling to pick sides in public. He took a seat near the middle, his heart steady but heavy. Margaret called the meeting to order. Her voice, calm and deliberate, filled the room. She began with routine matters, budgets, maintenance reports, procedural formalities. All of it mechanical, designed to delay the inevitable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she cleared her throat and announced the final item on the agenda. Proposed Amendment 20B, Decorative Restrictions and Property Standards. The air thickened instantly. Margaret spoke with rehearsed precision. She described the amendment as a necessary step to preserve community harmony and safety. She referenced traffic concerns, complaints about excessive lighting, and the so-called disruptive attention the neighborhood had received. Her tone was measured, professional. The voice of authority cloaked in reason, but beneath her words was venom. When she finished, silence hung in the room. Then, slowly, Ethan stood. His voice was calm, not loud, but it carried weight. He reminded the room that Maplewood Heights was supposed to be a community, not a kingdom. He spoke about the joy his display had brought to children, about the neighbors who had rediscovered friendship under the lights. He asked a simple question. When did happiness become a violation? There were no shouts, no applause, only quiet reflection. Even those who feared the HOA couldn't deny the truth in his words. Margaret tried to respond, but her tone faltered. The certainty that had always shielded her began to crack. She repeated phrases like property values and aesthetic standards, but they no longer landed. They sounded hollow against Ethan's sincerity. Then, Jenna, the youngest board member, asked to speak. Her voice shook slightly, but her conviction didn't. She admitted that the board had gone too far, that the HOA had become something it was never meant to be, a weapon against its own residents. Her words cut through the tension like a blade through ice. The crowd stirred, heads nodded, a few even clapped softly. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The time came for the vote. Margaret raised her hand first in favor. Two other board members followed hesitantly. Then Jenna raised hers, against. Another followed, then another. A murmur spread through the crowd as the realization settled the vote was tied. All eyes turned to the final board member, a quiet, elderly man named Mr. Harlan. He had barely spoken during any meeting in years. Now, under the gaze of hundreds, he cleared his throat and spoke for the first time that anyone could remember. He said that he had lived in Maplewood Heights since it was founded. That once the community had been filled with laughter, cookouts, and kindness. Not fines, not fear. He said Ethan's lights reminded him of that time, and that the neighborhood needed more of it, not less. Then, slowly, he raised his hand against the amendment. The crowd erupted. Applause filled the hall, echoing off the walls like a burst of freedom. Margaret's expression froze. The motion failed. The amendment was defeated. The lights, the joy, the rebellion, all of it was safe. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Neighbors surrounded him, offering handshakes and congratulations. Some were teary-eyed. Others simply smiled, small, quiet smiles of relief. But amid the celebration, Margaret stood motionless. The woman who had ruled Maplewood Heights for 15 years looked lost, diminished. Her power, built on fear and control, had evaporated in a single vote. Without a word, she gathered her papers, turned from the podium, and walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. Outside, the night air was still. Snow fell gently under the streetlights. When Ethan returned home, the North Pole house glowed brighter than ever. The crowd followed, laughing, singing, and celebrating beneath the shimmer of 1,000 lights. For a moment, it felt like the entire world was bathed in color and warmth. Ethan stood at the edge of his driveway, looking at the smiling faces, the children dancing in the snow, the lights reflecting in the windows. He knew it wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was about what those lights represented: freedom, unity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. But even as peace settled over Maplewood Heights, a faint unease lingered, because somewhere beyond the laughter and lights, in a house now dark and silent, Margaret Drayton was sitting alone at her dining table, staring at the HOA charter in front of her. And though her reign had ended, her bitterness had not. The night of the vote had ended the battle, but not the war. In the days that followed the vote, Maplewood Heights seemed to breathe for the first time in years. The tension that had once hung over the neighborhood had lifted, replaced by laughter, music, and the quiet hum of renewed camaraderie. People who had barely spoken to each other began stopping on sidewalks to chat. Kids played together again in snow-covered yards. It was as if Ethan's lights had thawed something far deeper than the winter cold. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he truly belonged. The North Pole house, once a symbol of defiance, had become a symbol of unity. Each night, families gathered to admire it. Cars lined up down the street, and the local paper even ran a headline that read, "Man who fought A turns neighborhood into winter wonderland." Ethan didn't seek fame or credit. He only wanted peace, and for a while he had it. Yet, even amid the joy, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. Margaret Drayton had vanished from public life after the failed vote. She stopped attending meetings, stopped sending letters, stopped showing her face entirely. Her home, once meticulously kept and glowing with spotless perfection, now stood dark and empty-looking, shutters closed, the driveway untouched by footprints. Neighbors whispered that she'd resigned from the HOA quietly, citing health reasons. Others said she'd simply withdrawn, humiliated by her defeat. But Ethan couldn't help feeling a trace of sympathy for her. For years, she'd built her identity around control. And when that control slipped away, so did the meaning she'd tied to her life. As Christmas Eve approached, snow began to fall steadily. Ethan spent the morning repairing a few lights that had flickered out during the last storm. He took his time, not rushing, letting the quiet of the season sink in. From his yard, he could see the other homes around him, now adorned with their own decorations. For the first time,